So my name is Bruce Sutton. I work for Rubicon Archaeology, and I'm a project manager for a company that's based in Cork. And I was the commercial senior archaeologist on this scheme for the archaeological services contract. So thanks for coming. The talk today is about the archaeological discoveries on the Killaloe Bypass, Shannon Crossing, and R494 improvement scheme, which from now on, I'm just going to call the Killaloe Bypass because it's got too long a name otherwise. So these works were undertaken well in advance of construction on the project, which is kind of standard for this project type. Back in the early noughties, they used to bring us on at the same time as construction, and then the contractors would have claims going all over the place as we were holding them up. So these days, the archaeological works are usually undertaken about 2 years before construction is even due to start. So the Killaloe Bypass comprises a western bypass of Killaloe, the new Brian Boru Bridge across the Shannon, and the upgrade to the 494. It's about 6.2 kilometers long, which makes this a relatively small project compared to other road schemes. It starts northwest of Killaloe town, curves to the west, and crosses the Shannon about 1 kilometer south of Killaloe and Ballina. And it then runs south along the existing roadway, terminating northeast of Bird Hill. Topography's steeply sloping on the northern end, kind of along here, looking out over the town and the loch, before changing to kind of more flat, undulating pasture in the south down here. It's in the counties of Clare and Tipperary, and the scheme for this is was completely managed by Clare County Council rather than Tipperary. These schemes take a long time to plan. They think that from initial inception, most schemes take about 20 years before they're finished. So even on this one, route selection was in 2000. So when you're complaining that this road took ages, this is standard on all these road schemes, even for these small ones. Route selection took place back in 2009. And the EIS then for this scheme wasn't issued till 2012. There's a lot of planning hoops to jump through, all these different cogs that they have to kind of go through to get all these different processes done. So the environmental impact assessment was prepared by Rohan and O'Donovan in 2012. And that and the cultural heritage chapter in that is mainly a desk-based survey with site visits, although on this, I think some survey works were done in the River Shannon at the same time. This identified that there was only 2 recorded monuments within 100 meters of the scheme. There was a possible monument, possible enclosure monument, kind of up in the northwest in Knockaclevaughan, and then there was a holy well, but that is submerged on Friars Island in the middle of the river. So the EIS listed several mitigations to be undertaken before construction could start. So that was test trenching of all greenfield locations, such as demolished, also areas where there's demolished structures that are visible on historic maps but are no longer there. The banks of the River Shannon, a mound noted during a walkover in Rohan Townland, and others. There was also additional underwater survey in advance of bridge construction and a targeted geophysical survey of the area surrounding the enclosure up in the northwest, which, by the way, found nothing, and the testing found nothing. The enclosure was only there and marked as a known archaeological site because it had been noted in aerial photographs from the 1990s. So it wasn't a known monument, it was more of a suspected monument. So Rubicon Archaeology were awarded the Archaeological Services contract in 2020, and this included 4 stages of works, which is the standard format for archaeological contracts issued. And we'll go through all those kind of stages of works in a minute. The groundworks were undertaken in late 2020 and 2021, back in the days when we were all wearing masks, crossing the street to get away from each other rather than trying to say hello, and explaining to the guards why we were out driving in the middle of the day more than 2 kilometers from where we lived, which we had to do nearly every day, and we had to get a letter to show the guards on a regular basis. So final post-excavation and report writing were only finished in early 2025, and that's a long drawn-out process as well. There's all specialist analysis and all those kind of things involved. And then, of course, the final step is this dissemination. So stage 1 test trenching. So this is, as I said, the schemes are split into 4 stages, and we'll go through those one at a time. So stage 1 test trenching is a process where available sections of the route, we go in and dig by machine. This involves digging a trench along the entire centre line of the route with offsets and adding additional trenches for anything previously noted on mapping, or caught on geophysical surveys, or anything that actually looks interesting on the day that we're there. There might be lumps and bumps in the field that we might say, well, we should really put a trench into that as well. This is done to try and identify any areas of archaeology that may exist subsurface on the scheme. The vast majority of archaeology, you don't know it's there. It's under the topsoil, and it's been so long since it was actually in use that it's just vanished. So nearly 6.5 kilometers of trenches were excavated in only around 25 fields. This doesn't seem like a lot, but much of the scheme, say nearly the entire southern half of it, goes along existing road, which meant that it wasn't trenched. Some larger schemes, like the M28 River Bypass, that's only 12 kilometers long. Only twice the length of this, but that had over 50 kilometers of test trenching dug across it, which is us standing there watching a machine all day long, digging these trenches for weeks and weeks on end. So some larger schemes, so on to the next one. So initial test trenching was done by another company called John Cronin and Associates in early 2020, before the current archaeological contract, with Rubicon finishing this area as more lands became available. These test trenching works identified 9 archaeological sites, one in Tipperary town, in in Tipperary, and then the other 8 in Clare, all kind of around the western side and the southern side of Killaloe. So following on from stage 1 works, we go into what's called stage 2. And basically in stage 1, we've identified areas of known archaeology, and we've agreed with the client that we're going to go back and we're going to open areas around those and have a look to see, are they actually archaeology or not? So this involves going back with machines and stripping these areas. Anything we found during the test trenching, we've identified by GPS survey. So we know within a centimetre where it is. So we can easily go back and find it again and strip an area around it to make sure we've got an adequate buffer zone around the archaeology. So these areas are opened up by machine, stripping the topsoil to remove, to expose possible archaeological features preserved in the subsoil. And it should be noted, you don't get archaeology in the topsoil. It survives in the subsoil. Bioturbation and soil movement destroys any kind of archaeological features that you might have had that have cut into the soil. Obviously, if you've got a wall or something like that, that might remain, but you usually don't get that out in a rural setting like this. So once that's done, the entire area is cleaned by hand using hose, shovels, and buckets. So like some of these areas are fairly big. And as you can see here, the ground conditions aren't exactly nice. This was in a peat kind of bogland area down in Shantroud, and it rained most of the time, and the water flooded down the hill. So we were constantly pumping it out, as well as trying to clean this at the same time. So you can see the lads are trying to clean the areas over there. And then eventually, once we've done all the hand cleaning and we've mapped everything, we then get onto the kind of more quintessential view of an archaeologist, which is on their hands and knees with a trowel, investigating a few of the individual features to confirm whether they're archaeology or not. Because sometimes on the test trenching, we might find things that then aren't archaeology, and then we can discount them in the stage 2 stage. But at this point, all of the areas were identified as being archaeological. So what happens then is we photograph these preliminarily, we take a few notes, and we map the areas to say what archaeology is there. So there's just a few examples of the kind of output that you get from this stage 2. It's fairly basic mapping at this stage. So once this work is complete, we move on to what people are more familiar with. And that's stage 3 excavation. And this is hand excavation of archaeological sites, the act of excavating and recording archaeological remains. And we refer to this as preservation by record, or preservation by written record. And that means that we're compiling a written and photographic archive of the site during and following the excavation to preserve the site, along with relevant report writing. This differs to preservation in situ, which is basically where they don't go and look at it at all. They just leave it where it is and they don't touch it, and it's there for future generations. But there's 2 things with that. One, it's really impractical on a road scheme to suddenly leave an archaeological site in the middle of your road because you can't put tarmac over it. And 2, we actually learn nothing from it. If we decide to leave something in the ground, we've taken no samples from it, we've learned no information from it, and essentially we've just buried it again for somebody else to come there in the future and dig it up and record it and gain all the information from it then. So it's only by actually excavating these sites that we're actually getting to learn any information from them. So this stage 3 work isn't just about excavation. It also includes preliminary reporting, sieving of samples, assessment of the samples, and making recommendations for further analysis of recovered material. After the stage 3, we get into stage 4. Don't worry, this is the final technical stage now. We'll get into the archaeology after this. So this is the final stage. This is stage 4 post-excavation. So this involves analysis of all finds and samples that we've recovered. It involves radiocarbon dating of any kind of charcoal or bone or organic material, writing of the final reports, archiving to national monuments, and finally kind of getting up here and talking in front of people and doing dissemination. So the final part kind of involves, that was a more active historical society than a dressing up in period gear. I'm very disappointed, people. So this involves the public speaking, writing articles, and on larger schemes, the production of a scheme monograph. Like where there's a huge amount of archaeology. There might be a TII book published by Wordwell on the archaeology of the scheme. So now that we've got the logistics of these contracts out of the way, let's kind of talk about the findings. So this is a kind of color-coded representation of the archaeological sites on the scheme. And it should be noted that this is a relatively small-scale scheme with kind of relatively small-scale archaeology, but it has provided some important information. There was also very few artifacts. Contrary to what most people think, we're not there for the finds and the artifacts and the axe heads. We get more information from the site itself and the sampleable material that we take out of it. It's really nice to find an axe head, don't get me wrong. When you find a metal spearhead in a ditch, it's amazing. Or you find a flint object that's been there for 6,000 years, that's amazing too. But we get more information from the kind of features and the sites themselves. Like sometimes we'll dig a Bronze Age house and find no artifacts, and people will say to me, "Sure, but did you find nothing?" And you were like, "Well, we had an entire Bronze Age house that we excavated. We didn't need to find objects. Objects are kind of the cherry on the cake, but they're not the main thing of what we do. They're very much a minor part of what we actually do." So as you can see from this graph, the majority of the activity on the scheme is prehistoric. So before the start of the early historic period, which is in kind of 400 or AD 400. This isn't uncommon on schemes that run through rural areas. And there's quite a few sites that consisted solely of prehistoric pits, with later, say, post-medieval agricultural features truncating them. So seven of the sites contains small-scale prehistoric activity in the form of shallow pits. These range in date from the Neolithic to the Iron Age. So the Neolithic starts at maybe 400 BC, sorry, 4000 BC, and then you're looking at the Iron Age finishes at AD 400. So you're talking that is a time frame of 4,500 years. So these features may not look interesting, they look very bland. Most people don't even notice them until you've done this job for a few years when you're topsoil stripping, because they're just little variations in the ground. But they're also not the most interesting thing to excavate sometimes, but they can contain important information. So the pits at Knockicleford 1, for example, that doesn't exactly look very exciting down there on the bottom left. But that gave evidence of prehistoric agriculture with a quantity of barley grains being recovered. So barley is the oldest crop species and the main prehistoric crop, and it's cultivated from the early Neolithic onwards. And it's used to make a variety of foods, including porridge, gruel, bread, and beer. There was also very small quantities of wheat, which can be used to make a more kind of upper class variety of bread. So charcoal from the pits also indicated that there was a local prehistoric woodland of oak and hazel, and it gave evidence for the felling of oak, which ties in with the agricultural evidence and possibly land clearance for farming. And that's just from a tiny pit like that. So as I said, we can get more information from the sample material and small features than we can from actually finding an arrowhead. So two of the bigger sites we had on the scheme were prehistoric Fullock Fair or burnt mounds. Now, some of you may remember doing Fullock Fair history in school. I think they used to do it. I'm not sure they do anymore. So these are the most commonly excavated sites in Ireland. There's over 8,000 known monuments, And typically on road schemes, between 30 and 50% of all excavated sites are burnt mounds. That tends to be because road schemes tend to target the ground that these sites are in, rather than a reflection that there's loads of these sites. Road schemes target marginal ground that farmers don't mind losing quite so much, and they can maybe pay a little bit less money to buy. And these sites tend to be in those areas. So these sites see a peak of use in the Bronze Age between maybe 2200 and 800 BC. But their use does extend from the late Neolithic, maybe 2700 BC, and into the Iron Age, but not really into the kind of early medieval period. So they appear as mounds of heat-shattered sandstone with soil and charcoal, and they can be sometimes found by farmers when they're ploughing. They're very distinctive. There's lots of broken stone. The soil is very black, and it gets everywhere in your skin when you're excavating it. So activity at these sites, and you can see it here, is kind of focused around a pit or trough. And these are generally in wet ground. And the trough itself fills naturally with water. Stones are heated in a nearby fire and transferred to the pit to heat the water. And that brings it to the boil. We don't quite know what the water's used for. There's various interpretations, such as cooking, bathing, saunas, and then there's industrial processes such as drying clothes, tanning hides, brewing of beer, and things like that. So, as I said, because they need to fill with water, they're located in marginal ground. They can often be found in clusters. You often find them in groups, and that's because as later communities come along to these areas, they see these mounds in the ground, and they identify that this is therefore ground that is good for this kind of activity. So you sometimes get mounds that might be like 1,000 years later. You know, they've got absolutely no relation to the earlier archaeology, and they just come along and they use the same areas. So very few artifacts are found on these sites, and you know, quite a lot of people find them very mundane to excavate, especially if you get some of the ones that might be in kind of a slightly drier ground. As you can see from the look on this AI-generated archaeologist's face, digging his burnt mound, who doesn't look very happy. That's what most people's faces can look like on a rainy day when you're on site. But you can also see the faces, you know, you can't really see the faces on these three. This was excavation at Shantroud again. Unfortunately, you can't see their faces because back again, despite the fact we were outside, it was COVID and we had to wear masks all day, even if we were like 5 meters from each other. So this was the conditions, or the typical conditions on a kind of more wetland burnt mound. So as I said, these sites, they're not very pleasant to work in. You kind of live in your waterproofs all the time. Even when it's dry, you tend to be in your waterproofs most of the time, just because you're walking around in the mud. Like the mud could be like over ankle deep. And you've got boards to kind of get rid of the mud, but they just start sinking. So in some of these areas, they can be not very nice places to work sometimes. So there were 2 burnt mounds on the scheme. Oh, by the way, this is the only time I've ever seen a piece of gold found on a burnt mound. Before anyone thinks this was not on this scheme, before there's any gasps, this was in County Waterford. I just thought I'd put it there as an example that you can actually find things like this. You know, we found a flint knife on one recently on another site. And this is the only time gold has ever been found on a burnt mound. So we all live in hope when we're excavating these. So there was one site down in Knockadromin, which, if you remember, was in Tipperary and was right down the southern end of the scheme. So this is at the base of silt layers. So this is right next to the Killaloe River. And what you don't know is that field next to the Killaloe River is about 1.5 meters deep of silt, 1.5 meters to 2 meters. It's flooded on a regular basis. So these layers have built up and built up and built up over the time. And the burnt mound area itself was on a ridge of natural subsoil kind of just over this floodplain. So this might have been a kind of drier area as it was flooding. And eventually then, I suppose, the silt would have got up so far and got rid of that. And there is later activity that we'll talk about in a little bit, higher up in the silt layers on the same site, which is really unusual in a rural setting, because normally you just get kind of one level of archaeology and that's it. So the second much larger site was located at Shantroud, which is just west of the River Shannon and just south of Killaloe town. So this was a multi-phase site with activity from the late Neolithic to the late Bronze Age, and it was in use for almost 2,000 years. Low mounds in the field would serve as markers, like I said, for later communities, that the area was suitable. It was located in an area of marginal ground. As you kind of came down the slope here, you kind of hit the kind of more bog area. Those of you might remember this, there was a little plantation woodland that the road now kind of cuts through as it comes over the bridge. You can kind of see the woodland on the right-hand side, and there's a stream that just runs at the east. So peat accumulation had undertaken at the base of the slope, and that ensured that there was anaerobic conditions, which means that there's no oxygen in the peat, so organic material can survive. There's no bacteria then, because there's no oxygen, there's no bacteria, they can't degrade anything organic, so you can kind of get organic preservation within there. So these mounds were intact, being visible as you could actually see them as you came down the slope as bumps in the ground, if you knew what to look for. And it was obvious that this area didn't get ploughed, because that's what usually flattens these sites out, is agricultural processes in the kind of thousands of years since they've been used. So there were 3 recorded mounds, 3 shallow spreads, and additional mounds located outside the scheme boundary. So you can see here, there's the 3 mounds, mounds A, B, and C. You could see 2 more mounds outside the scheme boundary, and these were kind of mounds with a shallow hollow in the middle where the trough was, and then there was a possible pond. So these features all seem to be kind of grouped around this, what would have been a prehistoric pond, but is now completely silted up. So the mounds appeared, so the mounds in the west, and this was the earliest activity. So this saw initial use during the the late Neolithic. And the site then appears to have been abandoned, with peat accumulating across the mound. And later, in the Middle Bronze Age, there's additional activity kind of here. So the Neolithic activity is here, and obviously extends outside the line of the road, and then it's abandoned for 1,000 years, peat accumulates across it, and then this later activity and this trough is in use. So a pollen core was taken from the peat deposits above and below the Neolithic mound, and this showed that the mound was located on the fringes of kind of a waterlogged alluvial woodland of alder, oak, and hazel. And it identified that the mound activity likely had an impact on this woodland, reducing certain species and introducing a wider variety, probably by establishing clearings in the woodland for kind of more light-demanding shrubs and trees to flourish. Otherwise, it would have just been a kind of dense oak, hazel, and alder woodland. Pollen also indicated the presence of grazing animals nearby, which gives further evidence of kind of prehistoric farming in the area. So as there's 2 wooden troughs on this, not in good condition, as we'll see in the one in A in a moment. So trough 1019, which was against the kind of western balk, 2 pieces of alder. The trough timbers themselves were dated to between 2,841 and 2,474 BC. And just for those of you who don't know about radiocarbon dating, that is about as accurate as our dating gets with radiocarbon dating. 200 to 300 years. We don't really get more accurate than that. Dendro dating can give you a nearly exact date, but radiocarbon dating only gives you like something like this. And it's at about 95% certainty. So there's a very, very slight chance that it did just kind of wobble either side of that as well. So the Neolithic one was built out of alder, and the timbers were radially and half split, which is much easier to do with stone tools. If anyone's ever split a log, it's much easier to split one from the middle out, or to just half split it, rather than trying to go kind of across the side of it. It's very hard to do with a stone tool. So the later trough then, that was built of alder and ash, and it's about 1,000 years later at 1,700. So there's no continuity here in these communities. There's no someone telling somebody else, go down there and build your burnt mound. This is, 1,000 years have passed. The Normans have just invaded. This is 1,000 years ago. There's no huge continuity. So facets on this one suggest that the use of flat metal axes was used, because the facets on the wood, which you'll see in a minute, are much flatter, and the timbers are split both radially, half split, and tangentially. So there's the Neolithic one. Only 2 pieces of wood extending out from the side. The rest of this is still preserved in situ outside the road scheme. And that should be stressed, is we only dig what's to be destroyed. Everything else that's outside the road scheme is preserved in situ and left as is. We don't touch anything else. So this is the Eastern Trough, and this is a kind of a more complex kind of Middle Bronze Age trough. Timbers were in very poor condition. I'm guessing this was slightly higher up, that it had been kind of waterlogged intermittently, which means that the timbers kind of degrade because they don't have kind of pure anaerobic conditions. But then again, they have been in the ground for 3,500 years, so we'll kind of give them that excuse, I suppose, at least. In the next image, so in this one, we can kind of see some of the recovered timbers. So you can clearly see all the facet marks along the length of this. And this is where, when it's been split, someone's gone along it with an adze and shaped it afterwards. So you can kind of see the individual marks of where these people have gone along and kind of shaped this wood 3,500, 4,000 years ago, which is, it's a great feeling when you find these kind of things in the ground. So here's another one. These has got facets from an axe. You can kind of see them kind of here, and there's a triangular one there, and that's where this tree has been felled due to how sharp the facets are. Here's just another couple of pictures of the kind of, oh, sorry, that was the pictures of the other couple of pictures of the wood. These are kind of artist drawings that go in the report at the end. So these are just kind of the end pieces of some of those ones that you saw the photographs of a minute ago. So the Eastern Mound, Mound A, was a much better preserved, so the woodline, Mound A, it's a large intact mound. It was 15 meters across. Radiocarbon dating indicates this is middle to late Bronze Age. It contained a very well preserved and elaborate wooden trough. And charcoal shows a selective use of hazel and alder as fuel at this site. So they're selecting smaller pieces of alder and hazel so that they're not removing the woodland, but then oak and ash, they're felling that for clearance to kind of probably to facilitate agriculture. I should point out as well that these things are large. This is 15 meters across and probably about 80 centimeters deep, and it's mainly made of stone. And we have to dig that by hand. We're not allowed to use machines. We're shovel, mattock, or pickaxe and a wheelbarrow, and we are pushing this stuff across muddy ground to spoil heaps that could be like 30 to 40 meters away. So this is why a lot of people don't like digging these sites. And that's the same with ring forts and things like that. We dig, everything is done by hand. We're not allowed to use machines for pretty much anything. And we're probably one of the few industries that still dig everything by hand. Construction these days would try and use mechanical means whenever possible. So this is the woodline trough in Mound A. It was much better preserved than the two in Mound B. This was built kind of in the late Bronze Age, between 1219 and 1016, judging from the radiocarbon dates. So how this was dug was, the pit was cut into the peat, and then they lined the base of it with moss. And over this was laid a base of split roundwoods with side and end timbers, which you can see these ones here, held in by pegs in the corners. And what the moss is for is the water for these comes in from the bottom. So they dig it down to the kind of clay, the water comes in from the bottom, and the moss serves as like a filtration layer. So this is anaerobic. You can pull this moss out of the ground and it's like it went in like 2 days ago. You can see the moss leaves and smell it and all that kind of thing. And, it's fascinating when you can do that. It's been in the ground for 3,500 years. In total, 41 timbers were recorded and analyzed from this. These are mainly alder with birch, hazel, ash, and holly. They've been cut by flat metal axes, and several have been shaped by an adze, similar to the Middle Bronze Age trough that we spoke about a minute ago. So you can see it's quite an elaborate construction, and these things, it doesn't look like it, but most of them are actually cracked and broken. So by the time they come out of the ground, they very rarely survive in this format. They've been in the ground for too long. Yes, they look amazing here, but by the time you get them out of the ground, they've kind of broken up. So you have to make sure that you're recording them as much as you can while they're in the ground. And even then, certain ones of them go off for specialist analysis, but we do a lot of recording on site to record the kind of axe marks, any kind of woodworking, how they're split, and all that kind of stuff. So here's just a few more photographs of this trough. Luckily, we had a nice day for the taking of it. And to make this would have been a substantial undertaking. It would have required the felling, trimming, splitting and shaping of multiple trees with what to us might seem like poor quality bronze implements. It would have taken several days and been undertaken by a skilled craftsman. On other schemes, burnt mound troughs several miles apart can sometimes be very similar in design, suggesting they might have been constructed by the same person or that people were sharing construction methodologies. Here we can see a selection of the work pieces, including the shape piece on the left that's kind of got the ad marks along it, and then kind of posts and stakes. These would have been the corner pieces. You can see that other than that one earlier, which had very sharp kind of facet marks, these are very long. So these would have been fairly sturdy when they went into the ground and could have been easily driven into the peat and the underlying clay. So Mound C is in the very northwest corner. This is the latest in the sequence on site, and it's only partly within the lands made available. And this is kind of very late Bronze Age, 1100 to 900 BC. Most of this actually remains in situ outside the scheme. And as I said, there's at least three mounds there that we can kind of see outside the scheme. There's part of Mound A, there's Mound C, and then there's troughs. There's Mounds E and D there that we just numbered because we just saw them. So the last prehistoric site is Killaloe 1 in the north of the scheme, at the top of the slope overlooking the town. And this is where we got this nice drone view from on a foggy morning. So the site at Killaloe 1 was radiocarbon dated to the Middle Bronze Age and comprised of pits, post holes, and stake holes with a complex triangular structure in the east. It was badly truncated by agriculture, with numerous lazy beds excavated across the area, likely dug by hand in the kind of 18th or 19th century. 2 archaeological objects were recovered from this site. There was a small fragment of Middle Bronze Age domestic pottery or cookware, and a possible Neolithic to early Bronze Age scraper. This would have originally been used to kind of work hides and was recovered from one of the post holes on the site. It's thought that the arrangement of features at Killaloe 1 represent the remains of a Bronze Age house. These are typically round houses, 6 to 7 meters in diameter, and they have a central hearth. You can see hearths kind of here, and internal divisions. In the Middle Bronze Age, entrances on Bronze Age structures became kind of more elaborate, and it's thought that the complex triangular arrangement of post holes in the east and stake holes could represent one of these kind of elaborate entrances, kind of with your kind of main kind of doorway post there. And this was looking east, which has a kind of great view down over the town and over the river and the loch. Unfortunately, it's right at the edge of the scheme, so we couldn't go further to investigate. So this is often the case with archaeology. Unfortunately, sometimes you're only getting a partial picture because you can't, the site continues outside where you're working. The deposition of that scraper in one of the construction post holes wouldn't be uncommon in a house structure. Valued items, often from an earlier period, are regularly found in prehistoric structural features such as post holes. And these are thought to kind of be a blessing on the structure, although it would have been fixed and replaced on a regular basis. So this is what such structures are thought to have kind of looked like. They're roundhouses. You kind of see a replacement of this kind of in the maybe later medieval, kind of when the Vikings arrive. So our prehistoric evidence, despite being relatively low in size, has provided evidence of activity from the Neolithic to the Iron Age, and is some of the first radiocarbon dated activity from the Killaloe area, because there's been very little excavation done in this area to date. The problem is a lot of excavation tends to get done on infrastructure schemes, and I suppose this is the first road scheme or anything that's been done here. So we have a possible Bronze Age house at Killaloe 1 overlooking the loch. So burnt mounds aren't settlement sites themselves, but they are indirect evidence of settlement. House sites are typically nearby, on drier, higher ground, and within easy walking distance. And this ties in with the information gathered in the EIS, which identified a large number of, say, known prehistoric monuments and find spots within its study area. Such prehistoric settlement must have been facilitated by access to the loch and the River Shannon. And this must have been a hub for waterborne trade. Many prehistoric logboats have been identified during loch surveys across Ireland. So charcoal from the prehistoric sites has indicated that oak, ash and hazel woodland was dominant across this area, and it suggested that woodland clearance for agriculture has been undertaken. And this is backed up by the cereal grains that we saw in those kind of earlier features, along with kind of the presence of grazing animals identified during the pollen analysis. So this shows a continuity of activity from 6,000 years ago to the present day in the region. People were farming the land, raising their children, and just living their lives. And that, to be honest, we tend to forget that these people are not so different from us. They are Homo sapiens sapiens. They are the same as us. They just don't have technology. They don't have mobile phones. They can't fly anywhere in a plane. But they are the same as us. They live the same lives as us. They had the same worries as us. Maybe not, how much money have I got in my bank? But, how much food have I got for the year and that kind of thing. So these people are us, just with a different level of technology and probably, a different language. So we'll take a quick look at historic activity identified in the scheme, which is kind of after AD 400, which is considered the end of the prehistoric. So only 3 sites had historic activity, and it's fairly limited. One is Knockadromin that we spoke about earlier in the floodplain of the Killaloe River, and then there's Bally Valley and Shantrad 1. So with charcoal production pits down at Knockadromin, these date from the Iron Age to the 19th century, and they get eventually replaced by industrialization. One good thing about these is we typically know that they're within woodland. Charcoal is much easier to transport than wood. So they don't transport the wood very far, they turn it into charcoal, and then they transfer the lighter product. So we know that this area would have been woodland. And this example, I know this is historic, but this example kind of bridges the gap between the late Iron Age and early medieval. You can see these examples. That's kind of a historic kind of reconstruction of somebody doing this kind of activity. And this is kind of an old, abandoned kind of experimental one. So what they do with these is they basically just fill a pit full of wood, they leave a vent, and then they set fire to it for days. And then somebody has to stand at this for days and make sure that the fire doesn't go out and doesn't get too hot. Because if it goes out, you've got to take all the wood back out again, you've got to pack it all back in again, and you've got to set fire to it again. And if it goes too hot, then everything you've done is wasted because you get no charcoal left at the end, and all you get is ash. So how do we know that this is how it's done? Well, there's experimental stuff that happens. This is kind of, that looks like some guy's on his phone, but I think he's looking at charcoal in that image. So there's experimental archaeology gets done. Not only that, this was done up until the late 19th century, early 20th century. There's actually historical accounts of how it's done. And there's photographs, of how it's done. You can't really get more kind of good information on how it's done than that. And also, this is something that's still done in what we would call less developed countries these days. They still make charcoal. And the reason we make charcoal is usually it's for industrial purposes. So charcoal flares less than wood. So when you're making pottery or you're smelting iron, you don't want your heat to flare. So the charcoal is used for kind of industrial purposes. So these sites are fairly standard in size and form. They're usually over about 1.5 meters long, rectangular and shallow. The lower layers just have residual charcoal left over from the final firing, while the upper layers are silt that accumulates after abandonment. And here you can see the Knockadromin example after cleaning before excavation. So it doesn't look like much. They are fairly ubiquitous. And here we'll just go through, these are the various stages of excavation. We kind of half section and record the layers, and then we take out the final layers until we've got the cut of the feature itself, which we then record and plan and photograph. And as I said, preserve it in a written record so that we know exactly what was there. And you can see all this kind of orange clay around it. This is oxidized clay. So the process of heating in the charcoal production pit oxidizes the clay, removes the oxygen from it, and changes the color to kind of be in this bright orange. So unlike domestic sites and burnt mounds, the charcoal from these is fairly unvaried. There's only one species in this, hazel, and that's because it's being made for a strict kind of industrial use. They want one type of wood to use all the time. They don't want a mixture of wood types. The other feature at Knockadromin 1 was the base of a slag pit furnace. So metalworking in this time is a really specialized craft. Craftsmen would sometimes travel between small settlements, trading for items to fix. These could include, I'm going to show you some pictures now, don't get excited, they're not from this game. These could include like pins and nails, like on the M28, we got a bill hook, agricultural implements, farm tools, They might even have made weaponry. You know, yet again, that was from the M28, the spear. But what I mean is this wasn't something that's common knowledge. Even today, this is specialized. That these people would have kind of gone around and traded for this kind of skill. So the example, knock a drum in, looked like this when we found it. You know, it's just a small black hole in the ground, a circle of charcoal with bits of slag deposits in the soil, and it's described as a slag pit furnace, and it's common from the 5th century to early 6th centuries, and then it gets replaced by other furnace types. And this example kind of dates to between 435 and 597 AD. So the charcoal recovered from this was purely oak, nothing else. There's 50 fragments, all just of oak. This is what a slag pit furnace would have looked like. The majority of the features above ground, only the very base that contains the waste product remains at the type of excavation. It would have been made, they just would have made a furnace every time they needed one. They just made it out of clay, they broke it apart when they finished using it, and then they just walked away. So all this upper stuff is gone because it's in the topsoil later on, and all that we're left with is this lower bit. So all we have is something like that. But, you know, we get some good information from it. We get the charcoal, we get the slag, we can look at what time of furnace it was, what date it was. Sometimes we can tell whether it was from smelting or forging or that kind of thing. So now we're going to jump forward nearly 1,500 years to take a look at the post-medieval activity recorded on the last two sites. So a brick clamp was identified up at Bally Valley 1, adjacent to where the big roundabout is now, or it could just be right under the eastern kind of side of the roundabout, I'm not quite sure. These are temporary structures for the production of brick, usually locally. They're located both close to the raw material and to the place requiring the brick, because it's very heavy. Both raw end products were very heavy to transport before railways and canals were invented. And really, it's these two things that see the death of these, because localized brick clamps kind of fall out of fashion when it becomes more economical to use industrial transport and to build them in bulk. So you only see these until a certain period. So this is a long process. So these things are about 5 meters tall. Even a small brick clamp would have taken about 2 to 3 weeks to fire. So this is a long time. It's done very, very slowly, because all they want to do is, when we talked about oxidization, that's what they're doing to the clay. They want that to happen to the brick. The oxygen goes out of it, it hardens. I'm sure there's other chemical processes at the same time, but that's what happens to the brick. So these can take weeks to do. Someone has to stay and tend this all the time. So brick sizes change constantly over time. So it's really, really hard to try and say, we've got this kind of brick, therefore it dates to like 1840, because there's such things like, say, the brick tax of 1784, which basically what they did is they taxed every single brick that was made. So what everyone started doing is making really big bricks, so that they had to pay less tax. And then they rescinded that tax and brought another one in. And because of the tax, it didn't make a standardized large size. Everyone just started making them bigger. So these things can be very hard to identify exactly when they come from. So what it looks like on the ground is it's a large area of oxidized clay and an amalgamation of badly fired brick, likely to facilitate local construction. I mean, it may have been used to help build any of the brick elements of Bally Valley House, which is thought to have been built at around 1800. Although, to be honest, we didn't have access to Bally Valley House to go and knock pieces of brick off their facades, so we couldn't really check. Often, say some of the larger homes, the chimneys would have been made out of brick. So it could have been to facilitate the chimneys in Bally Valley House, but we really just don't know. And unfortunately, there's no way of finding out. So the other post-medieval site was a mill race to the northwest of the Chantrad Warmburnt Mounds, just upslope from it. Mill races are a steady source of water supply from streams and rivers to mills. This has to be just right. It's like a Goldilocks zone. Can't be too fast, can't be too slow. They have an average gradient of only 1 in 625, or about half a degree. And they often incorporate ponds and sluice gates into their design. So just imagine that this has to go and use existing topography to take from one point to another. So the example here starts just west of Ballytye Bridge and runs just east to Manor Mills, which is just south of Killaloe town. And that's a distance of 2 kilometers. To build something this long with a minimal gradient but making sure you've still got a little bit of a gradient because the water has to flow one way. This must have taken an amazing engineering feat for something that was kind of done in the kind of 18th, 19th century. Probably, not nearly rivaling the aqueduct, the larger aqueducts of the Romans, in a much earlier time. So Manor Mills is listed on the historic maps as being a corn and woolen mill, and so is Killaloe Mill just to the northeast. That uses the canal, the water from the canal. And sometimes these later features, while they're not seen as quite so interesting from an archaeological point of view, they can be interesting because you have a lot of historical documentary sources that if you really have the time, you can go and kind of research and say, oh, look, there's Manor Mills. You can find out who ran it, who owned it, where they lived, and get that information. But you have to, that's a lot of research, and you have to be able to try and get access to the material. So here you can see, that's the line of it, the blue line on that one. And it follows that line because it follows that contour. It needs to get that slight gradient to get the water from the west to the east, not too fast and not too slow. And this is just where it went through the scheme. It was only a very small section of it. It wasn't very big in the scheme. These sites aren't necessarily that interesting. What is really interesting with them is the feat of engineering that must have gone into place to build it in the first place. This is just to get water from one place to the other. They didn't have machines to dig this. Someone dug a 2-kilometer long ditch, to get water from one place to another. So within the scheme, it was just seen as a kind of backfill ditch. And what was different about this from regular ditches, it had loads of river gravel in the base of it. This was obviously infilled in the 20th century, so it's very, very recent. And that's because the map that we just saw is kind of early 1900s. So this must have been just backfilled during the agricultural period. The kind of modern historic period. So what's interesting to note, we're kind of finishing up now. What's interesting to note is all our prehistoric activity is kind of more domestic in nature, whereas all of our historic activity is kind of more industrial. We're looking at a complete difference, and that's, maybe to do with increased population, that we're kind of looking at more specialization. And sometimes these later industrial features can be the ones that, say, local groups get more interested in because you can trace them much easier. Not many people can go out with a machine and dig 6.5 kilometers of test trench along the countryside to try and find kind of prehistoric archaeology. Some of this historic stuff is much easier to try and trace and to get interested in. And I suppose on just that note, I want to say thanks to everyone for coming. We were probably not quite expecting maybe this many people. We did ask for 50 chairs, but we still didn't have enough. I hope it's been somewhat informative on what was discovered along the Killaloe Bypass, Shannon Crossing and R494 improvement scheme. I just want to acknowledge the people included on this slide. All of them have helped to build this contract to a satisfactory conclusion, which is what we're all trying to aim for, as well as trying to find some archaeology. Although the biggest thanks always goes to the crew who worked in really poor conditions in really wet weather to gather this data. Without them, I wouldn't be given the opportunity to get up here and take all the credit. So thanks for coming, everyone.